The September sun blazed across the Wyoming Territory, like molten copper casting harsh shadows that offered no mercy from the relentless heat. Clara Whitman knelt beside her shattered water barrel, her calloused hands trembling slightly from a combination of exhaustion and mounting dread. At 28, she had learned that frontier life demanded constant repair. Tools broke without warning. Fences sagged under prairie winds, and hope required daily mending like everything else that mattered in this unforgiving land. The wooden staves had split during the night's unexpected frost, precious water seeping into the thirsty earth around her small homestead claim, like lifeblood draining from a mortal wound. She worked methodically despite her growing anxiety, wrapping lengths of wire around the damaged barrel, while her mind drifted inevitably to darker territory. 6 months had passed since Lucas died at the Copper Gulch stamp mill, yet questions gnawed at her consciousness with persistent hunger. The mine foreman claimed her husband had stumbled drunk into the crushing machinery during night shift. But Lucas never touched liquor in his entire life. He kept a signed temperance pledge, tucked carefully inside his well-worn Bible, and quoted scripture against drink every Sunday, without fail. At the hastily conducted coroner's inquest, Greasy Pete Miller had sworn under oath that Lucas reeked of whiskey. That fatal night his testimony delivered with oily confidence that made Clara's skin crawl. But she knew her husband's habits better than any lying stranger who would perjure himself for silver coins. The pieces of Lucas's death never fit together properly, like a quilt sewn with mismatched patches that revealed the seamstress's desperation. Why would a man who considered alcohol the devil's own poison suddenly drink himself into a stupor? Why had no one else smelled liquor on his breath before the supposed accident? And why had Greasy Pete been so eager to testify when he rarely spoke to Lucas during their brief acquaintance at the mining operation? The thunder of approaching hoofbeats shattered Clara's troubled thoughts, like glass breaking against stone. She straightened slowly, shading her eyes against the merciless glare, as 2 riders crested the low rise east of her claim. Even at considerable distance, she recognized Otto Brennan's characteristic slouched posture and the nervous way young Rudolf Kessler constantly fidgeted with his leather reins. Both men worked freight wagons for Conrad Dietrich's extensive mining operation, and their unexpected presence on her isolated land meant trouble, as surely as storm clouds meant lightning and destruction. Terror crept through Clara's chest as she forced herself to stand upright. Showing weakness to predators like these only encouraged worse behavior. She had learned that harsh lesson repeatedly over the brutal months since Lucas's death. The Wyoming Territory operated under different rules than civilized society, where strength was respected and vulnerability was exploited without mercy or hesitation. "Afternoon, Mrs. Whitman." Otto's voice carried false friendliness as he reined his bay gelding to a calculated halt 20 feet away, close enough to intimidate through proximity, but far enough to avoid immediate retaliation should she prove more dangerous than expected. His partner positioned himself strategically to block any retreat toward the cabin, where her Winchester rifle waited uselessly beyond reach. "Mighty hot day for outdoor work, ain't it?" Clara rose carefully from her kneeling position, brushing accumulated dirt from her faded calico dress, while keeping her movements deliberately non-threatening. Years of frontier living had taught her to read men's intentions through subtle signs, the way they held their shoulders, positioned their hands near weapons, controlled their horses with unconscious aggression that revealed their true nature. "Mr. Brennan, Mr. Kessler." She nodded politely to each man in turn, though every survival instinct screamed for her to run toward the distant tree line, where pursuit would be more difficult. "What brings you gentlemen to my homestead on such a fine day?" Otto spat a stream of tobacco juice that darkened the dust near his horse's hooves, the brown discharge aimed deliberately close to Clara's worn boots, in a calculated display of disrespect. The acrid smell of unwashed bodies and stale whiskey drifted from both riders on the afternoon breeze, mixing with the sharper scents of leather gun oil, and something else she couldn't identify, but which made her stomach clench with unease. Well, now that's a most interesting question indeed, ma'am. Otto's pale eyes held the cold calculation of a man who enjoyed wielding power over the helpless. See, me and young Rudy here been having extensive conversations with Mr. Dietrich about the trail situation developing around these particular parts of the territory. Clara's chest tightened, making each breath a conscious effort. The trail Otto referenced was a well-established public thoroughfare carved deep by countless wagon wheels and cattle drives over the past decade, connecting her isolated homestead to Willow Springs 3 miles south. She used that vital route twice weekly to trade mended clothes and laundered linens for essential supplies, as did several other struggling settlers scattered throughout the area who depended on the connection to civilization for their very survival. I wasn't aware there was any trail situation requiring discussion. Clara replied carefully, though her voice sounded thin and strained even to her own ears. The words felt like walking across thin ice that might crack at any moment. Rudolph shifted restlessly in his saddle, his young face twisted with a kind of nervous aggression that marked men trying desperately to prove themselves dangerous to older, more experienced companions. At barely 20, he possessed the reckless cruelty of youth combined with the desperate need for approval that made him unpredictable and therefore especially hazardous. Mr. Dietrich's becoming increasingly concerned about security matters throughout this entire region, ma'am. Rudolph said, his voice cracking slightly with excitement and barely contained violence. All kinds of genuinely unsavory folks been using that trail recently. Dangerous drifters, hostile Indian raiding parties, maybe even organized road agents looking for easy targets to rob and murder. Could prove mighty dangerous indeed for a defenseless woman living all alone without proper masculine protection. The implied threat hung in the superheated afternoon air like gun smoke, visible and choking. Clara glanced involuntarily toward her cabin, calculating the distance to her Winchester rifle propped just inside the doorway. 50 yards across, completely open ground, with no cover whatsoever. She would never make it if these men chose immediate violence over continued negotiation. I genuinely appreciate Mr. Dietrich's neighborly concern for my welfare, she said with careful diplomacy, fighting desperately to keep her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. But I've experienced no trouble with the trail during all my time here. Otto's grin revealed tobacco-stained teeth like yellowed tombstones, and Clara noticed with growing alarm how his right hand rested with casual familiarity near the worn wooden grip of his holstered Colt revolver. The weapon showed signs of frequent use and careful maintenance, suggesting its owner was no stranger to violence and bloodshed. That's purely because you've been exceptionally lucky so far, widow woman. But luck runs out faster than water from a cracked barrel, and when it does, you'll need friends who understand this harsh country and its many dangers. Otto's fingers drummed against his gun butt with practiced menace. $5 monthly seems quite reasonable for genuine peace of mind and reliable protection. Small price indeed to pay for continued safety and security. Clara's fear transformed gradually into cold anger that made her hands clench involuntarily into trembling fists. $5 represented nearly half her total monthly income from the backbreaking work of sewing and washing clothes for the few remaining honest families scattered throughout the increasingly lawless region. The outrageous demand was nothing less than naked extortion, disguised as neighborly concern. And all three of them understood perfectly the real transaction being proposed with barely veiled threats. I'm afraid I simply can't afford such expensive peace of mind, Clara said with considerably more steadiness than she actually felt coursing through her terrified body. Otto's false smile vanished instantly, like smoke dissipating in sudden wind, his pale eyes going flat and predatory in a way that reminded Clara of hunting wolves she had occasionally spotted during harsh winters. That's genuinely unfortunate, Mrs. Whitman. Real unfortunate indeed for someone in your particularly vulnerable position. You see terrible accidents happen with disturbing regularity to folks who don't properly value available protection when it's generously offered by concerned neighbors. The carefully chosen word, accidents, hit Clara like a physical blow to her solar plexus, driving what little breath remained from her constricted lungs. Was Otto brazenly referring to Lucas's suspicious death at the stamp mill? Did these dangerous men possess specific knowledge about her husband's fate that hadn't emerged during the perfunctory inquest conducted by obviously corrupt local officials? Accidents precisely like my husband's tragic death. The question escaped Clara's lips before her rational mind could prevent it hanging in the air like a challenge she couldn't retract. Rudolph's nervous fidgeting increased noticeably, his young hands twitching toward his weapon, while sweat beaded on his forehead despite the dry mountain air. But Otto's expression remained coldly amused, like a well-fed cat toying methodically with wounded prey. Poor, unfortunate Lucas. Genuinely terrible thing falling into that massive stamp mill machinery like he did that night. Course, any man who drinks heavy liquor sometimes loses his footing around such dangerous industrial equipment, especially during night shifts when supervision might be less than optimal. Otto's voice carried mock sympathy that made Clara's skin crawl with revulsion. Guess you didn't know your beloved husband quite as well as you thought you did, ma'am. My husband never consumed alcohol in his entire adult life. Clara replied with absolute conviction, born of 7 years of intimate marriage and shared daily existence. Well, now, that certainly ain't what Greasy Pete Mueller testified under proper legal oath at the official coroner's inquest. Said poor Lucas was stumbling around drunk as a sailor on shore leave, reeking like he'd bathed in a whiskey barrel before approaching that dangerous machinery. Otto's voice dripped with false concern that barely concealed his obvious enjoyment of Clara's visible anguish. Perhaps the grieving widow needs to accept some uncomfortable truths about her dearly departed spouse's secret habits and moral failings. Clara's hands trembled violently with barely suppressed rage at the casual desecration of Lucas's memory and reputation. These evil men were systematically mocking everything good and decent about her murdered husband, while simultaneously threatening her own life and livelihood, and she found herself essentially powerless to prevent their cruel psychological torture. Otto dismounted from his horse with calculated slowness, his metal spurs jangling against the stirrup leather in a sound that seemed unnaturally loud and menacing in the oppressive afternoon stillness that surrounded them. Each step toward her was measured and deliberate, designed to increase her terror through proximity and the implicit threat of physical violence that could escalate without warning. Now then, let's return to discussing that extremely reasonable protection money arrangement, shall we? Otto continued conversationally, stepping close enough that Clara could smell the revolting combination of stale whiskey days-old sweat and something else she couldn't identify, but which made her stomach churn with nausea. When she tried instinctively to back away from his threatening presence, Rudolph smoothly maneuvered his horse to block her potential retreat, effectively trapping her between them. $5 by month's end, Mrs. Whitman. No exceptions, no negotiations, no extensions of credit. Otto reached out with deliberately slow movements to straighten Clara's faded bonnet with mock gentleness, his calloused fingers brushing against her cheek, in a gesture that felt more like a threat than courtesy. She jerked away instinctively, and the sudden motion seemed to amuse him greatly, judging by his widening grin. Don't be unfriendly now, widow woman. Mr. Dietrich genuinely values cooperation and mutual understanding from all his neighbors throughout this territory. Makes everything so much more pleasant and civilized for everyone involved. Clara tried desperately to pull away from his looming presence, but Otto's hand shot out with surprising speed to grab her wrist with sudden, brutal violence. His thick fingers closed around the delicate bones like iron bands designed to crush rather than restrain, and terror flooded her nervous system as she realized with crystal clarity how utterly isolated and vulnerable she was in this moment. miles from the nearest, help with no one to hear her screams or witness whatever these men might choose to do. "Let me go this instant," she demanded, with as much authority as she could muster, proud that her voice remained relatively steady, despite the fear making her heart hammer against her ribs. "When we're completely finished with our important business discussion, ma'am. Not a moment before." Otto's iron grip shifted higher on her arm, his thumb pressing against the pulse point in her wrist with deliberate intimacy that made her skin crawl with revulsion. "You see, there's been considerable talk circulating around town recently about you consorting inappropriately with hostile Indians. Would that accusation happen to be true?" Dread flooded Clara's system as the implications of his question struck home with devastating force. She had indeed spoken courteously on several occasions with Hayamovi, a northern Cheyenne warrior, who occasionally traded valuable furs and handmade goods in Willow Springs for essential supplies. Unlike the vast majority of white townspeople, Clara treated him with basic human decency and respect, accepting his honest payment for goods and services, without the suspicious hostility and barely contained violence that most whites displayed toward any Indians they encountered. "I conduct fair trade with anyone who offers honest payment for goods and services," Clara replied, lifting her chin defiantly despite the overwhelming terror clawing at her throat. "That's simply good business practice in frontier territory." Otto's vicious backhand cracked across her cheek with stunning, unexpected force, snapping her head sideways and immediately filling her mouth with the sharp copper taste of fresh blood. The brutal blow knocked her carefully positioned bonnet completely loose, sending her brown hair spilling over her shoulders in disheveled waves, while stars exploded behind her closed eyelids. "Wrong answer entirely, you Indian-loving whore." Otto snarled with genuine fury, flexing his fingers, as if seriously considering striking her again with even greater violence. Decent white women got absolutely no business whatsoever dealing with murdering savages, especially not widow women, who should certainly know better than to associate with their husbands' potential killers. Clara straightened slowly and carefully, wiping blood from her split lip with the back of her trembling hand, while righteous fury gradually replaced paralyzing fear in her chest. These evil men had systematically murdered her innocent husband, terrorized her relentlessly for months through threats and intimidation, and now struck her brutally on her own legally owned land. She was thoroughly tired of being constantly afraid, completely tired of feeling utterly helpless, and absolutely tired of allowing these vicious bullies to control every aspect of her increasingly desperate fate. "Get off my property immediately," she said quietly, each word carefully carved from stone and unshakable determination forged in the fires of suffering. Otto laughed with genuine amusement and raised his hand threateningly for another savage blow, clearly enjoying the absolute power he held over a supposedly defenseless woman, isolated from any possible assistance. "Or what exactly will you do about it? Call the territorial law for help? Deputy McCall's probably unconscious drunk in the saloon by now. And besides, he certainly knows which side his bread's properly buttered on in this county." The anticipated second strike never landed. Thunderous hoofbeats suddenly erupted across the grassland as a lone rider crested the distant rise at full gallop, his mount's iron shoes drumming a rapid, urgent tattoo against the hard-packed earth. Even at considerable distance, Clara recognized with surge of desperate hope the distinctively fluid way the approaching newcomer sat his horse Hayamovi of the northern Cheyenne, riding his beloved bay mare Sihu with the easy, natural grace of a man literally born in the saddle. The warrior was 25 years old, lean and powerfully built, his body corded with functional muscle, earned through countless miles traveled in the harshest country imaginable. He wore traditional buckskin clothing that had been crafted with obvious care, shirt and leggings, dyed soft brown and decorated with intricate blue beadwork that caught and reflected sunlight along with a single sacred eagle feather braided into his long black hair. That feather marked him unmistakably as a proven warrior, earned through documented acts of courage against enemies who would kill him without hesitation given the slightest opportunity. Sihu skidded to a dramatic halt in a spray of dust and loose gravel, and Hayamovi swung down from the saddle with liquid grace before the mare had completely stopped moving. His obsidian eyes swept over the tense scene with trained military precision, cataloging immediate threats and calculating potential responses in the space of a single heartbeat. Otto and Rudolph released Clara simultaneously and stepped back several paces, their hands moving with practiced instinct toward their holstered weapons. But Hayamovi ignored them completely in those first crucial seconds, approaching Clara directly with obvious concern that made her chest tighten with unexpected and entirely unfamiliar emotion. "You are injured," he observed with quiet authority, his carefully learned English precise, but retaining the formal speech patterns of someone for whom it remained a deliberately acquired second language. Years of necessary trading with whites had given him functional command of their complex tongue, though his natural dignity transformed even simple statements into something approaching formal pronouncement. Clara touched her split lip, self-consciously tasting fresh blood on her fingertips while trying to process the sudden shift in dynamics. "It's nothing particularly serious?" Hayamovi's expression hardened visibly as he examined the rapidly darkening bruise spreading across her cheek with gentle fingers that contrasted sharply with Otto's brutal touch. When he slowly turned his full attention to the freight haulers, something genuinely predatory flickered in his features, the controlled stillness of a hunting wolf carefully assessing dangerous prey before deciding whether to attack or seek easier targets elsewhere. "These men struck you," he said with absolute certainty. It was not a question requiring confirmation, but a statement of observed fact that carried the weight of unshakable conviction. Before Clara could formulate any response, Otto found his voice, though it cracked noticeably with nervous bravado that betrayed his growing uncertainty about the situation's direction. "This don't concern you in the slightest, Redskin. Move along before you get seriously hurt or killed." Hayamovi turned his complete attention to the freight haulers with deliberate slowness, and Clara watched both men visibly flinch under his steady measuring gaze. The warrior stood perhaps 6 feet tall, not exceptionally large by frontier standards, but he carried himself with the controlled stillness and absolute confidence of a man completely comfortable with violence and death in all their varied forms. "It concerns me now," Hayamovi said quietly, his voice carrying across the distance like distant thunder promising devastating storms to come. Rudolph's young face flushed bright red with nervous aggression and wounded pride, his trembling hand twitching visibly toward his gun butt. "There's 2 of us and only 1 of you Indian. Don't much like them odds, do you?" Hayamovi's smile held absolutely no warmth or humor, only the cold promise of swift retribution delivered without mercy or hesitation. "I have faced considerably worse odds than this and lived to speak of the experience. Have either of you, gentlemen?" The statement carried absolute conviction, born of hard experience and genuine combat, delivered without boasting or theatrical emphasis. This was not empty bluster designed to intimidate, but simple fact, stated without emotion, and Otto seemed to recognize instinctively the crucial difference between mere posturing and authentic lethal capability. "Look here, we got no particular quarrel with you personally," Otto said, his voice considerably less certain than it had been moments earlier. "We're just conducting some neighborly business with Mrs. Whitman about important security matters. Business that requires striking defenseless women." Hayamovi's tone remained perfectly conversational, but Clara heard tempered steel beneath the calm surface. the controlled menace of a perfectly balanced blade, barely restrained in its sheath, ready to be drawn at the first sign of continued aggression. Sometimes stubborn women need firm reminding of their proper place in civilized society. Rudolph interjected with adolescent bravado, clearly trying to reclaim lost ground and impress his older companion through displays of casual cruelty. Those particular words proved to be a grave tactical mistake. Hayamovi moved with fluid speed that seemed to bend time itself, closing the significant distance between himself and the younger man in 3 quick, economical strides. Before Rudolph could react, or even comprehend the warrior's intentions, iron fingers locked around his throat with crushing force, lifting him effortlessly onto his toes while cutting off his air supply. "If they touch you again," Hayamovi said to Clara without removing his intense gaze from Rudolph's rapidly purpling face, "I'll bury them myself. This is not threat or bluster, but simple promise that will be kept." The vow carried the weight of absolute certainty delivered in the same tone another man might use to discuss weather conditions or crop prospects. This was not mere intimidation designed to secure temporary advantage, but a simple statement of inevitable fact violate his clearly declared protection. And death would follow as surely as sunrise followed the darkness of night. Otto's Colt cleared leather with practiced speed, born of years of violence. But Hayamovi had anticipated the desperate move with a warrior's battle-honed instincts developed through countless life-and-death encounters. Still gripping Rudolph's throat with his left hand, he swept the younger man's legs with economical efficiency and sent him crashing into Otto just as the freight hauler's gun reached firing position. Both men went down hard in a tangle of limbs, explosive cursing, and scattered equipment. Hayamovi stepped back gracefully and drew his own weapon, a bone-handled knife with a blade that gleamed like captured sunlight. The steel was perhaps 8 inches of perfectly honed death, maintained at razor sharpness and worn smooth by constant use and careful attention. "Stand up slowly and keep your hands clearly visible," he instructed with calm authority that brooked no argument or resistance. "Any sudden movements will be interpreted as hostile intent and responded to accordingly." Otto and Rudolph climbed slowly to their feet, with whatever dignity they could salvage from their humiliating defeat, both men visibly shaken by the swift reversal of fortune and the demonstration of superior skill. The Colt lay forgotten in the dust between them, but neither dared reach for it under Hayamovi's unwavering lethal attention. "This ain't finished by any means." Otto gasped while massaging his bruised ribs, his face burning with humiliation and impotent rage. "Mr. Dietrich's got a long memory and deep pockets for revenge. He don't forgive slights like this, and he certainly don't forget insults to his authority. Tell Mr. Dietrich he can find me north of town whenever he wishes to discuss these matters properly." Hayamovi replied with perfect composure and obvious confidence. "I will be waiting patiently for his convenience." The freight haulers retrieved their horses and mounted with as much dignity as they could salvage from their comprehensive defeat, which amounted to precious little. Otto jerked his reins with unnecessary violence, making his gelding dance sideways while foam flecked the bit. "You just signed your own death warrant, squaw man," he snarled venomously over his shoulder as they prepared to leave in defeat. "And hers too. Ain't no place in this entire territory where you can hide from Dietrich's reach when he decides to collect what's owed." Adaster, I do not hide from any man, white or otherwise," Hayamovi said simply, and something in his tone made both riders spur their horses into hasty retreat rather than continue the confrontation. After the hoofbeats finally faded into blessed silence, Clara found herself alone with the Cheyenne warrior, who had now twice appeared seemingly from nowhere to rescue her from escalating danger. The afternoon sun slanted lower across the endless grassland painting long shadows between them like bridges she wasn't entirely sure how to cross safely. "Ah, thank you," Clara said quietly, her voice thick with complex emotions she couldn't quite identify or properly name. "Once again, you've saved me from serious harm." Hayamavi sheathed his knife with the same fluid motion he had used to draw it, the deadly blade disappearing as smoothly and quietly as it had appeared. "You should not thank me prematurely. Those men will certainly return with additional companions, and next time they will come properly prepared for serious resistance." Clara felt her brief moment of relief evaporate like morning dew under the harsh sun of reality. "What would you suggest I do to protect myself?" "That you do not remain here alone tonight or any night in the immediate future. Desperate men do increasingly desperate things when their authority is challenged. Dietrich's men are very desperate indeed to maintain their reputation for intimidation." The warrior's professional assessment aligned perfectly with Clara's own instinctive fears. Otto and Rudolph had been publicly humiliated in front of a witness, and men like them rarely accepted such treatment without violent retaliation, specifically designed to restore their damaged reputations and demonstrate the consequences of resistance. "I suppose I could go to town," Clara mused aloud, considering her limited options. "Perhaps stay with Hattie Morrison at the schoolhouse for a few days." Hayamovi nodded approval, his expression brightening slightly with what might have been relief. "The teacher is genuinely wise woman who understands frontier dangers. She keeps a loaded shotgun and knows how to use it properly against unwelcome visitors." Clara packed her essential belongings quickly but thoroughly, gathering what she would need for an extended stay while securing her cabin as best she could against potential vandalism or outright destruction. Hayamovi waited with patient vigilance, methodically checking his mare's tack and scanning the horizon constantly for signs of returning trouble, with the perpetual alertness of a man who had survived by trusting his instincts above all other considerations. The ride to Willow Springs passed in companionable silence. Clara mounted behind the warrior on Sihu's broad, strong back. The bay mare carried double weight without complaint or visible strain. Her steady ground-eating gait consuming the miles between homestead and town, while the sun continued its inexorable westward journey toward the distant mountains that marked the territory's western boundary. As they approached the small settlement, Clara could see smoke rising from numerous chimneys and lamplight beginning to flicker in scattered windows as evening gradually descended over the territory. Willow Springs looked deceptively peaceful and welcoming after the afternoon's violence, though Clara had learned through bitter experience that appearances could be fatally deceiving on the frontier. "And Hayamovi," Clara said as they neared the schoolhouse, gathering courage to voice a question that had been troubling her thoughts throughout the ride. "Why do you continue helping me? We barely know each other, and associating with me could bring you serious trouble with Dietrich's organization." The warrior considered the serious question thoughtfully before responding, his voice measured and careful. "Because it is right thing to do. Because strong should protect weak rather than prey upon them. And because you treat me as man and equal, not as enemy to be feared or curiosity to be avoided." Clara understood his meaning immediately and completely. In a territory where the vast majority of whites viewed Indians with deep suspicion at best and murderous hatred at worst, simple human courtesy and basic respect were rare and precious gifts indeed. She had offered him that courtesy, unconsciously treating him no differently than any other honest customer conducting legitimate business. And now he repaid her small kindness with protection that could very well cost him his life. Hattie Morrison emerged from the schoolhouse as they dismounted, her steel-gray hair pulled back in its characteristic severe bun, and her intelligent brown eyes immediately taking in Clara's disheveled appearance and obvious distress, with the quick assessment of someone accustomed to dealing with frontier emergencies. At 55, the school teacher had witnessed enough violence and its aftermath to recognize the signs without requiring lengthy explanations. "Trouble, I assume?" Hattie asked without preamble, her voice carrying the brisk efficiency and calm competence of someone who had learned to handle crises through long experience. Clara touched her split lip ruefully, wincing at the persistent tenderness and the reminder of Otto's brutal violence. Otto Brennan and Rudolf Kessler paid me an unexpected visit. They wanted to discuss Mr. Dietrich's protection services in considerable detail. Hattie's mouth tightened into a grim line that aged her normally pleasant features considerably. "Come inside immediately. Both of you. We need to discuss what's been happening throughout this valley, and I'm afraid the news isn't encouraging." Inside the comfortable one-room schoolhouse, Hattie bustled about with practiced efficiency, preparing strong tea and examining Clara's injuries by the warm light of several oil lamps. The older woman moved with the sure competence of someone who had treated many victims of frontier justice, or the complete lack thereof. Otto's been making his collection rounds systematically throughout the entire month, like some kind of tax collector from hell itself. Hattie explained grimly as she carefully dabbed Clara's cut lip with witch hazel that stung like liquid fire. Every homesteader, every small businessman, everyone who depends on Prairie Rose Creek for their water rights and survival. Pay up immediately or face severe consequences, he tells them with that ugly, threatening grin of his. Clara winced as the astringent burned her wound, but welcomed the sharp pain as concrete proof she had survived the encounter relatively intact. How many have already succumbed to his criminal demands? Far too many, unfortunately. Amos Henderson held out bravely until they burned his entire wheat crop right in the field, destroying months of backbreaking labor and his only source of income. Dr. Edwin refused their demands until they broke his office windows twice in 1 week and began making specific threats against his patient's safety. Hyamovi listened intently from his position near the door, his face remaining expressionless, but his attention absolutely focused. Clara could observe him filing away each piece of information with military precision, gradually building comprehensive mental maps of alliances, threats, and tactical considerations that might prove crucial in the battles that were surely coming. During the following days, disturbing patterns emerged that confirmed Hattie's increasingly pessimistic analysis of their situation. Dietrich's systematic harassment escalated steadily from mere threats and intimidation to outright violence, specifically designed to terrorize the entire community into complete submission. Dr. Edwin Morrison's medical practice was vandalized repeatedly, his precious books scattered and torn beyond repair by men who seemed to take genuine pleasure in destroying knowledge and healing. Amos Henderson's remaining livestock was mysteriously poisoned during one terrible night, forcing him deeper into debt and desperation. Most troubling and ominous was the complete disappearance of Thomas Kellner, the county clerk responsible for maintaining all official records of land claims and water rights throughout the territory. Kellner simply vanished from his office one evening without trace or explanation, leaving behind clear signs of violent struggle and suspicious bloodstains that Deputy McCall dismissively explained as spilled ink from routine paperwork accidents. But it was Amos Henderson's increasingly suspicious behavior that first raised Clara's growing doubts about potential treachery within their small circle of resistance. The farmer, who had initially seemed completely broken by Dietrich's systematic persecution and economic warfare, began asking oddly specific questions about their defensive plans, meeting times, and the identities of potential allies. His inquiries seemed casual enough on the surface, but Clara noticed how his eyes would dart away nervously when pressed for details about his own recent activities and whereabouts. "I don't believe Amos is being entirely honest with us about his situation." Clara confided to Hattie during a private conversation 2 weeks after the confrontation at her homestead. Something about his behavior has changed significantly. Hattie's normally confident expression grew deeply troubled as she considered the implications. What specifically makes you suspicious of him? Several small things that individually might mean nothing but together form a disturbing pattern. The way he's suddenly become so intensely interested in our defensive preparations after months of wanting absolutely nothing to do with organized resistance. And I noticed he's been carrying fresh silver coins recently, money he shouldn't possess if his crops were genuinely destroyed as completely as he claimed. Their growing suspicions were confirmed in the most painful way imaginable, when their carefully planned mission to retrieve Kellner's hidden documents was betrayed with devastating precision. As Clara and her desperate team prepared to infiltrate the church basement under cover of darkness, they discovered Dietrich's men waiting in perfect tactical positions to intercept them, clearly having received detailed advance intelligence about their plan's timing and approach routes. Only quick thinking, desperate improvisation, and considerable luck had allowed their narrow escape to the mining compound. Later investigation would confirm their worst fears about internal betrayal. Henry eventually witnessed Amos meeting secretly with Jake Holcomb behind the mine office, their conversation conducted in hushed tones, while Holcomb handed the farmer what appeared to be substantial payment for services rendered. The sight of silver changing hands between supposed enemies confirmed that desperation and threats against his family had broken the farmer's resolve, completely transforming him from trusted ally into unwilling but effective spy. The betrayal cut particularly deep, because Amos had seemed like one of their own, a genuine victim of Dietrich's systematic cruelty, who deserved sympathy, support, and protection rather than suspicion. But the combination of economic pressure, physical intimidation, and specific threats against his wife and children had proven more than the poor farmer could withstand. Clara found herself unable to hate him entirely, understanding the impossible choice he faced between his neighbor's welfare and his family's immediate safety. But the damage to their cause was severe and potentially catastrophic. Meanwhile, Clara's relationship with Hayamovi continued deepening through shared dangers and growing mutual trust. One peaceful evening, as they sat beside a small fire north of town, while maintaining watch against potential threats, the warrior shared stories of his past that revealed the complex, thoughtful man beneath his stoic exterior. My father died at Powder River when I was barely 16 years old. Hayamovi said quietly, his voice barely audible above the crackling flames and night sounds of the territory. I took his war lance and rode against the cavalry that day, thinking that pure courage alone could somehow turn back the white tide that threatened to drown our people. I learned harsh lessons about the difference between bravery and wisdom through my own blood and pain. He showed Clara the puckered bullet scar on his left ribs, where cavalry fire had nearly claimed his young life during that desperate battle. The wound still causes me pain during hard physical exertion, constantly reminding me that survival requires both strength and intelligence, working together, not just one or the other. In return, Clara found herself sharing carefully guarded memories of Lucas that she had kept buried deep within her heart since his murder. He wanted desperately to build something genuinely lasting here in this territory, she said, watching sparks rise toward the star-filled sky like prayers seeking heaven. Not just a successful farm for our family, but a real community where decent people could raise their children in peace and safety. Dietrich destroyed that beautiful dream, along with everything else we held dear. During these quiet, intimate moments, Hayamovi patiently taught Clara practical skills that might save her life in the dangerous times ahead. How to move silently through darkness without betraying her presence. How to read subtle weather signs that could mean the difference between life and death. How to find accurate direction by the stars when landmarks disappeared. But more importantly, he demonstrated through consistent example that true strength came not from dominating others through violence and intimidation, but from protecting those who needed protection and could not protect themselves. A genuine warrior fights not for personal glory or conquest. He explained one night while teaching her to identify edible plants in the darkness, but to preserve what is good and innocent in the world around us. This is the real reason I help you and your people, because your cause is just and honorable, and justice always deserves strong, reliable allies. Conrad Dietrich himself proved far more complex and dangerous than Clara had initially assumed based on his reputation for simple greed and violence. During a chance encounter in Willow Springs, she overheard him speaking with passionate conviction to a group of visiting territorial officials about his grand vision for transforming the entire region. This valley possesses the natural resources and strategic location to become the foundation of true civilization in this wilderness. Dietrich declared his cultured voice, carrying the absolute conviction of a true believer. Properly managed mineral extraction could provide the capital necessary to fund schools, hospitals, churches, roads, all the essential institutions that separate civilized society from chaos and barbarism. But achieving that noble goal requires unified control and long-term planning, not the haphazard, inefficient arrangements of individual homesteaders pursuing their own narrow interests. Clara realized with chilling clarity that Dietrich genuinely believed his actions were completely justified by higher moral purposes. In his increasingly twisted mind, the systematic elimination of small farmers and independent settlers represented a necessary sacrifice for the greater good of progress and civilization. This self-righteous conviction made him far more dangerous than a simple criminal motivated by greed, because he possessed the fanatic's certainty that any atrocity could be justified in service of his grand vision. The mining compound itself revealed Dietrich's methodical approach to achieving total domination over the territory. Jake Holcomb, his chief enforcer and most trusted lieutenant, maintained detailed written records of every protection payment collected, every act of calculated intimidation, and every strategic move in their comprehensive campaign to control the valley. But Clara began noticing subtle signs of tension between Holcomb and his employer during her careful observations from concealed positions. During one heated argument, she witnessed from a distance Holcomb gestured angrily toward a worn daguerreotype he carried constantly in his vest pocket. His scarred face twisted with obvious grief and barely contained rage. Though she couldn't hear specific words over the industrial noise, his body language suggested deep personal grievance that went far beyond mere professional disagreement about tactics or compensation. Later, careful investigation revealed the tragic story behind Holcomb's hidden motivations and his true relationship with Conrad Dietrich. 5 years earlier, when Dietrich was first establishing his territorial claims and consolidating his power, a small but thriving mining camp had stood where the main operation now sprawled across the mountainside. Among the displaced families forced from their homes by Dietrich's legal maneuvering and economic pressure were Jake Holcomb's beloved wife Sarah and their infant daughter Mary, both bearing strong resemblances to Holcomb's scarred but still handsome features. Sarah and little Mary had died during the following harsh winter, victims of exposure and starvation after being driven from their home without adequate resources or shelter. The deaths were not technically murder in any legal sense, but they represented the direct, inevitable consequences of Dietrich's ruthless business practices and complete indifference to human suffering that stood in the way of his ambitions. Holcomb had joined Dietrich's organization not from loyalty greed or any desire for power, but from cold, methodical calculation. He had spent 5 patient years positioning himself as close as possible to his family's killer, waiting for the perfect moment to exact carefully planned revenge, while maintaining the appearance of nothing more than a competent hired gun. The bitter irony was almost poetic. Dietrich's most trusted enforcer was actually his most determined enemy, motivated by love rather than money. This crucial revelation came too late to alter their desperate mission to destroy the powder magazine, but it explained Holcomb's shocking final betrayal of his employer when the moment of truth finally arrived. His actions were driven not by mere pragmatism or professional opportunism, but by years of carefully suppressed rage and perfectly planned vengeance for the deaths of innocents. Clara's younger brother Henry emerged as a more significant figure than anyone had initially expected. At 22, he had come west seeking adventure and fortune, but had instead found only brutal labor under dangerous conditions and systematic exploitation by men without conscience or honor. His letters home had stopped arriving regularly in May, leaving Clara to worry constantly about his fate while dealing with her own mounting troubles and increasing isolation. Their reunion occurred through pure chance during one of Clara's essential supply runs to Willow Springs. She was emerging from the general store when she spotted a painfully familiar figure loading heavy freight wagons near the livery stable, with the mechanical, exhausted movements of someone pushed far beyond normal human endurance. Henry had lost dangerous amounts of weight during his months of captivity at the mine, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that had once been robust and healthy. His hands shook visibly from malnutrition and constant stress as he hefted 50-pound sacks of grain, and his eyes held the haunted, desperate look of a man who had witnessed unspeakable things and participated in actions that would haunt him forever. "Are ye worm?" "Henry," Clara called out with desperate joy, immediately dropping her purchases to embrace her brother with fierce protective affection. Henry's reaction was not the joyful reunion she had anticipated. Instead of happiness at seeing his beloved sister, his face went pale with what looked distinctly like terror. He glanced around nervously, checking for observers, before quickly pulling Clara into the concealing shadows between buildings with obvious urgency and fear. "Sis, you can't be seen talking with me like this," he whispered with desperate intensity, his voice hoarse from breathing mine dust and shouting over machinery. "It's not safe for either of us if Dietrich's men notice we're related." Clara studied her brother's haggard features with growing alarm and heartache at his obvious suffering. "What's happened to you? Why did your letters stop coming? I've been worried sick about your welfare." Henry's horrifying story emerged in halting, whispered fragments, a carefully orchestrated tale of debt coercion and systematic entrapment that made Clara's heart sink with each dreadful revelation. He had been caught in Dietrich's web through an elaborately staged combination of gambling debts and fabricated theft charges, the same proven pattern used to control dozens of other workers who lacked legal recourse, family connections, or financial resources to resist. Dietrich owns Deputy McCall completely, plus the circuit judge and at least half the potential jury pool throughout the county, Henry explained with bitter, hard-won knowledge. "Once you're caught in his system, the only ways out are complete submission, a pine box, or running so far that he can't follow. And he's got a long reach and plenty of men willing to track down escapees." But Henry had learned valuable intelligence during his months of forced captivity secrets, and information that could potentially destroy Dietrich's carefully constructed criminal empire if they ever reached honest territorial authorities willing to act on evidence rather than bribes. The mine owner had been systematically forging water rights documents, corrupting officials throughout the county government, and eliminating anyone who threatened his absolute control over Prairie Rose Creek and its tributaries. The original legal documents are hidden somewhere in town. Henry whispered urgently, constantly checking over his shoulder for potential eavesdroppers. Thomas Kellner managed to conceal them before he disappeared, but I don't know the exact location. Kellner was smarter than Dietrich gave him credit for. He suspected what was coming and took precautions. Clara felt genuine excitement stirring in her chest for the first time in weeks, hope blooming like wildflowers after spring rain. Could you find out where they're hidden? Could you discover the location through your position in the organization? Henry's face went even paler at the dangerous suggestion, fear making his already trembling hands shake more violently. Sis, you don't understand the terrible risks involved in what you're asking. Dietrich's got men watching everything and everyone constantly. If they catch me helping you or anyone else, then we make absolutely certain they don't catch you. Clara replied with newfound determination and steel in her voice. But we can't allow him to steal everyone's land and livelihood through fraud and systematic murder. Someone has to make a stand. The plan they devised was necessarily simple and straightforward, though fraught with deadly peril at every step. Henry would carefully use his access to Dietrich's operation to gather crucial intelligence about the hidden document's location, while Clara worked with Hayamovi and other potential allies to prepare for whatever violent confrontation was inevitably approaching like a summer thunderstorm. It was extremely dangerous, probably suicidal given the odds against them, but it offered their only realistic hope of breaking Dietrich's iron stranglehold on the valley before he completed his systematic land grab and eliminated all potential opposition. 3 weeks of intensive preparation followed with each passing day, bringing new risks and increasingly deadly challenges. Hayamovi moved skillfully between his band's camp north of town and the settlement itself, gathering crucial intelligence on Dietrich's forces and their capabilities, while quietly training willing townspeople in basic combat tactics and survival skills. Clara used her regular visits to outlying farms and homesteads to carry messages and coordinate resistance activities without arousing the suspicion of Dietrich's numerous spies and informants. The breakthrough finally came on a cold October evening when Henry managed to slip away from the heavily guarded mine long enough to meet Clara at the abandoned grain elevator outside town. His hands shook violently as he pressed a carefully folded paper into her palm with desperate urgency, constantly glancing over his shoulder for signs of pursuit. "Found them," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. "The original water rights documents and all of Kellner's evidence. He hid everything in the church basement before he disappeared, and there's a hidden compartment beneath the altar that nobody knows about." Clara's heart raced as she carefully unfolded the paper with trembling fingers, a hand-drawn map showing the precise location of a concealed space behind loose stones. If Henry was correct about what was hidden there, they finally had their chance to obtain the legal evidence needed to challenge Dietrich through territorial courts and federal authorities. "There's much more than just water rights," Henry continued breathlessly. "Kellner kept detailed records of every bribe Dietrich paid, every document he forged, every witness he eliminated or intimidated. It's all hidden together in that compartment, enough evidence to destroy his entire operation and see him spend decades at hard labor in the territorial prison at Laramie. But retrieving the precious evidence would require infiltrating the church at night, while avoiding Dietrich's increasingly frequent patrols throughout the town. It was exactly the kind of desperate gamble that could either save them all or result in their immediate deaths with no middle ground for partial success or negotiated surrender. The mission was carefully planned for the night of October 15th, when a new moon would provide maximum darkness for their dangerous infiltration. Clara insisted on participating, despite Hayamovi's strong objections and obvious concern for her safety, arguing that her knowledge of the church layout and her personal investment in the outcome made her presence essential to success. Besides, she added with grim determination that brooked no argument, "This is my fight as much as anyone's. Lucas deserves justice, and I fully intend to see that he gets it whatever the cost." The team consisted of Clara Hayamovi, Henry, and Tokola Hayamovi's 23-year-old cousin, a cheerful warrior whose scarred face bore silent testament to his courage in previous battles against overwhelming odds. They approached the church through the creek bottom, using the screening willows and cottonwoods for concealment from any watching eyes that might be positioned to observe their movements. The building sat on a low rise at the very edge of town, its white-painted steeple clearly visible against the star-filled sky like a beacon of hope or a target depending on one's perspective. No lights showed in any of the windows, and no guards were immediately visible around the perimeter. But Clara had learned through bitter experience not to assume safety based on appearances alone. They reached the church basement through a storm cellar entrance that Henry had carefully scouted during daylight hours, noting the rusty hinges and the positioning that would provide the best concealment during their approach. The underground space was cramped and musty, filled with stored hymnals, communion supplies, and the accumulated detritus of years of church activities. Using a carefully shuttered lantern for minimal light that wouldn't be visible from outside, they searched methodically, according to Henry's detailed map, until Clara found the loose stone that marked Kellner's desperate hiding place. The oilskin packet concealed behind the stone contained everything Henry had promised, and considerably more original water rights documents dating back 5 years that proved the legal claims of every farmer in the valley, detailed records of systematic bribes and forgeries that implicated officials throughout the county, and a lengthy confession letter explaining Kellner's actions and motivations before his forced disappearance. It was enough evidence to completely destroy Dietrich's operation and provide legal justification for arresting everyone involved in the conspiracy. But as they prepared to leave with their precious cargo, the unmistakable sound of multiple horses approaching at speed echoed through the night air. The riders were moving fast and directly toward the church with obvious purpose and determination, suggesting they possessed advanced knowledge of the infiltration attempt. Trap. Hayamovi said simply, his hand moving instinctively to his knife, while his trained eyes assessed their increasingly desperate tactical situation. Clara's heart sank as the devastating truth struck home with crushing force. Someone had betrayed them again, providing Dietrich's forces with detailed information about their plans, timing, and intended escape routes. Now they were trapped underground, with the enemy closing in from above. The basement had no windows for alternative escape and only one entrance, the storm cellar they had used for infiltration. They could attempt to fight their way out against unknown numbers of armed men, but 4 people against potentially overwhelming forces in open ground meant certain death for everyone involved in the doomed mission. It was Henry who suggested their last, desperate alternative, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying absolute conviction. The mine. If we can somehow reach Copper Gulch without being captured or killed, I know exactly where Dietrich keeps his blasting supplies. Nearly 600 pounds of black powder in wooden kegs stored in a stone magazine near the main stamp mill. The plan was complete insanity ride straight into the heavily defended heart of Dietrich's operation and destroy it from within using his own explosive materials. But it offered their only realistic chance of striking a decisive blow against his power, before being systematically hunted down and eliminated like dangerous animals. They escaped through the church's main sanctuary, while Dietrich's men conducted their thorough search of the basement, slipping away into concealing darkness as angry curses and frustrated shouts erupted behind them. The horses they had hidden in the creek bottom carried them north toward the mountains, where Copper Gulch scarred the landscape like an infected wound that refused to heal properly. The mining operation sprawled across a natural bowl in the hills like a vision of hell itself, all grinding machinery, billowing black smoke, and the demonic glow of furnaces that never slept or rested. The acrid smell of sulfur coal smoke and human sweat hung heavy in the mountain air, while the constant rumble of stamp mills and ore crushers provided both cover for their movements and a reminder of the industrial power they were attempting to challenge. Clara counted at least 30 separate buildings connected by narrow-gauge railroad tracks, that carried loaded ore carts between the various processing operations like iron arteries feeding a mechanical heart. Guard towers flanked the main entrance, and she could see armed sentries walking regular patrols around the perimeter with military precision. Guard positions. Hayamovi asked quietly, studying the formidable layout with professional interest and tactical awareness. Henry pointed out the specific locations with hard-won familiarity, the wooden watchtowers that commanded fields of fire across the approaches, the roving patrols that circled the perimeter at predictable intervals, and most importantly, the heavily built stone powder magazine that sat against the mountainside like an artificial cave. It was an extremely formidable target defended by experienced men, but desperation had a way of making impossible things suddenly achievable through sheer determination. The assault began just after midnight, when most workers would be either asleep in their barracks or focused entirely on their dangerous, demanding tasks. Tokala created an effective diversion at the main gate by setting fire to a carefully chosen stack of lumber and coal drawing guards away from the powder magazine, while the others slipped through a gap in the perimeter fence that Henry had discovered during his months of forced captivity. But as they moved through the industrial maze, disaster struck from an entirely unexpected direction. A carelessly positioned lantern fell from a loading dock 50 yards away, its shattered glass igniting spilled coal oil in a rapidly spreading pool of flame. The fire began racing along wooden walkways toward the powder magazine with hungry, terrifying intensity, creating a second countdown to catastrophe that could arrive even before Henry completed his careful preparations with the explosives. The spreading flames cast dancing orange light across their faces while casting writhing shadows that made movement seem supernatural. Clara could feel the heat on her skin, even at distance, and the acrid smoke made her eyes water and her throat burn with each breath. How long to set the charges properly and safely? Clara asked urgently as they reached the magazine entrance. 10 minutes if I do everything correctly. Henry replied, sweat already beading on his forehead from heat and stress. 5 minutes if I cut corners and take risks, but that increases the chance of partial detonation or premature explosion. Hayamovi studied the approaching flames with professional assessment, his warrior's experience allowing him to calculate time and distance with deadly accuracy. The fire will reach this building in 8 minutes, maybe less, with this wind pushing it forward. They had no choice but to work with desperate speed while Tokala and Clara fought the approaching blaze with whatever materials they could find: dirt, their own coats, even precious water from their canteens. Henry's hands remained steady despite the pressure as he carefully bored holes in the wooden powder kegs and connected them with precisely measured trails of slow-burning fuse, knowing that one spark in the wrong place could transform them all into scattered atoms. Inside the stone magazine, dozens of 25 and 50-pound kegs of black powder were stacked from floor to ceiling in neat rows that represented enough explosive force to level half the mountainside. The thick stone walls had been built to contain accidental explosions, which would actually work to their advantage by focusing the blast's destructive power when the time came for detonation. It was during this frantic, terrifying activity that Henry came face to face with Greasy Pete Mueller, the man whose false testimony had condemned Lucas to death and whose lies had destroyed Clara's faith in frontier justice. Pete emerged from the smoke, carrying a Winchester rifle, his oily features twisted with recognition and malicious satisfaction. "Well, well, if it ain't the widow's little brother," Pete sneered, raising his weapon with obvious intent to kill. "Come to visit the exact place where your brother-in-law had his unfortunate accident." Something fundamental and permanent shifted in Henry's expression as months of helpless rage finally found an outlet. The fear that had dominated his features was replaced by cold fury, born of accumulated injustice, and the burning need for revenge against the men who had destroyed his family's peace and happiness. You lying, murdering bastard," Henry said quietly, his voice carrying deadly conviction. "You killed him, didn't you? Pushed Lucas into that machinery while he was completely sober and defenseless." Pete's ugly grin confirmed the accusation, beyond any doubt, his enjoyment of the confession obvious and disgusting. Drunk or sober, he was getting far too curious about business matters that weren't his concern. Just like you are now, boy. But Henry was no longer the frightened, helpless young man who had been trapped by gambling debts and false accusations months earlier. The brutal labor, constant terror, and systematic abuse had forged him into someone harder, more dangerous, and completely capable of violence when justice demanded it. When Pete's rifle began swinging toward him, Henry moved with desperate speed and righteous fury, grabbing a heavy iron wrench from a nearby maintenance cart and swinging it with all his accumulated hatred and need for vengeance. The improvised weapon caught Pete across the temple with a sickening crack at the impact, dropping him instantly to the gravel. Henry stood over the motionless body for a moment, breathing hard, finally having struck back effectively at one of the men who had systematically destroyed everything his family held dear. "It's finished," he said simply, then returned to his explosive preparations with steady hands and completely clear conscience. They completed their dangerous work just as the approaching fire reached the magazine's outer wooden supports, the building now surrounded by Dietrich's armed men, but also threatened by flames that licked hungrily at structural beams. Their only escape route lay through a deadly hail of bullets toward the distant perimeter fence and whatever safety it might provide. Clara clutched the precious legal documents recovered from Kellner's hiding place as they burst from the building in a desperate rush toward freedom. The evidence of Dietrich's systematic crimes was worth more than gold or silver, but only if they survived long enough to present it to honest territorial authorities who couldn't be bought or intimidated. The running battle across the compound tested every survival skill Hayamovi had patiently taught Clara during their time together. Bullets whined past like angry wasps seeking targets, while they dodged frantically between ore carts and industrial machinery, using the heavy equipment as cover from the withering gunfire. Tokala provided crucial support with his rifle, picking off pursuers with the calm precision of an experienced hunter dropping game animals. They were within yards of safety and possible escape when Conrad Dietrich himself appeared directly in their path, blocking the route to freedom. With a nickel-plated Smith & Wesson revolver trembling in his pale hands. His normally immaculate and expensive suit was torn and blackened by smoke, his carefully groomed appearance destroyed, and his usually composed features twisted with rage and growing desperation as he watched his empire literally burning around him. 20 years of work. He snarled, his cultured voice cracking with emotion and fury. Everything I built with my own hands and vision destroyed by one stubborn woman who couldn't accept progress and the march of civilization. The ornate gun swung toward Clara's heart with obvious lethal intent, and she knew, with terrible clarity, that she was about to die within the next few seconds. There was no time to dodge the bullet. No cover within reach for protection, no realistic hope of mercy from a man who had ordered countless murders in pursuit of his grand vision. But before Dietrich could pull the trigger and end her life, Jake Holcomb stepped from the concealing shadows with his own weapon drawn and ready, aimed not at Clara or her companions, but directly at his employer's unprotected back. "That's enough, Conrad," Holcomb said quietly, his voice carrying 5 years of suppressed grief and carefully planned vengeance. Dietrich spun in complete confusion, his revolver wavering uncertainly between multiple targets while his mind struggled to process this unexpected betrayal. "Jake, what are you doing? Kill them immediately." Holcomb's scarred face showed no emotion as he reached slowly into his vest and withdrew the faded daguerreotype Clara had glimpsed during their heated argument weeks earlier. The photograph showed a beautiful young woman, holding a smiling infant, both bearing unmistakable resemblances to Holcomb's weathered features. "Do you remember the Morrison mining camp, Conrad?" Holcomb asked with deadly calm. "The families you displaced 5 years ago to expand your original operations." Dietrich's eyes widened with dawning recognition and growing fear as memory supplied the details he had deliberately forgotten. "That was simply business, Jake. Legal and entirely necessary for proper development of the territory's resources." Legal, perhaps, but not necessary, and certainly not merciful. Holcomb's voice carried the weight of accumulated sorrow and perfectly planned revenge. "Sarah and Mary Morrison, my wife and infant daughter. They died that winter because you took their home and left them with absolutely nothing in the world." The revelation struck Dietrich like a physical blow of the truth about his most trusted enforcer's real identity and motivations, hitting him with devastating force. His most reliable lieutenant, the man who had carried out his orders without question for 5 years, was actually the husband and father of victims from his earliest, most ruthless crimes. "Jake, I had no idea you were connected to those people. If I had known..." "You didn't care to know then, and you don't care now." Holcomb interrupted with cold finality. "You never cared about the people you destroyed in your quest for progress and civilization. They were just obstacles to be removed, not human beings with families and dreams." Holcomb's first shot took Dietrich's center mass, the heavy bullet doubling him over in surprised agony and shock. "This is for Sarah, who froze to death in a canvas tent because you needed her house for your operation." Dietrich tried desperately to speak, blood frothing from his lips as his body began shutting down. But Holcomb's second shot ended his reign of terror permanently. "And this is for little Mary, who never got the chance to grow up because of your greed." The mine owner collapsed among the scattered debris of his shattered empire, his pale eyes staring sightlessly at stars that had watched impassively over his meteoric rise and dramatic fall from power. "Why?" Clara asked, though she believed she understood the complex motivations behind his actions. Holcomb holstered his smoking weapon with practiced efficiency, his expression showing relief rather than satisfaction. "Because some debts can only be paid in blood. And because I've spent 5 long years waiting patiently for exactly the right moment to collect what he owed my family." The powder magazine exploded just as they reached what they hoped was minimum safe distance, and the massive blast lighting up the night sky like a miniature sun. The earth-shaking explosion sent shockwaves that could be felt for miles in every direction, and the towering pillar of fire and smoke that rose into the darkness was reported as far south as Fort Laramie. When the smoke finally cleared and the debris stopped falling, nothing remained of the once mighty Copper Gulch mine except a smoking crater that would never again yield silver or gold. The facility that had dominated the valley's economy and politics was completely erased from existence, taking Dietrich's power structure with it into oblivion. The aftermath brought swift justice from territorial authorities, who could no longer ignore such obvious evidence of corruption and violence. Jake Holcomb surrendered himself voluntarily to federal marshals from Cheyenne, confessing to Dietrich's killing, while providing crucial testimony about the mine owner's systematic crimes and the network of corruption that had enabled his reign of terror. The legal evidence Clara had preserved proved invaluable in ensuring that corrupt officials throughout the county were arrested, prosecuted, and removed from their positions of authority. Deputy McCall, the circuit judge, and dozens of other bought men found themselves facing federal charges for conspiracy, bribery, and obstruction of justice in the territorial court at Cheyenne. Legitimate water rights were restored to their original owners through proper legal channels, while the territorial government implemented new oversight procedures to prevent similar corruption in the future. The territorial governor himself issued a proclamation condemning the systematic abuse of power and promising that the district attorney would pursue all related cases with full federal backing. Amos Henderson, broken by guilt over his betrayal of people who had trusted him, chose to leave the territory entirely rather than face the neighbors he had endangered through his cooperation with Dietrich's organization. Clara felt genuine pity rather than anger toward the broken farmer, understanding perfectly the impossible pressures that had forced his tragic choice between family and community. Henry emerged from the ordeal completely transformed from naive youth into a man capable of fighting injustice through both courage and legal expertise. His engagement to Hattie Morrison was announced that Christmas, along with his firm decision to study law and dedicate his life to protecting communities from men like Conrad Dietrich. The Cheyenne band, no longer threatened by Dietrich's expansion plans, was able to establish a permanent winter camp in the Powder River country, with the territorial government's grudging approval. Hayamovi's role in ending the crisis had earned him respect even from officials who normally viewed all Indians as enemies to be eliminated or controlled. On a warm July evening in 1877, Clara sat peacefully beside Prairie Rose Creek, watching her infant daughter sleep in a cradle decorated with both Christian crosses and traditional Cheyenne symbols representing the blending of two cultures into something entirely new. The marriage ceremony had honored both traditions while creating bonds that transcended racial boundaries and social conventions. "Do you ever regret the choice you made?" Hayamovi asked quietly, his voice barely audible above the water's gentle murmur and the evening songs of meadowlarks. Clara considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, thinking carefully about the comfortable house she had abandoned, the predictable routines of civilized life she had left behind, and the approval of white society she had forfeited forever through her choices. Then she looked at the man beside her, her husband, partner, and closest friend, at the beautiful child who bore features from both their heritages, and at the vast landscape that stretched endlessly under star-filled skies that had witnessed their struggle and victory. "Never for a single moment," she said with absolute conviction, born of hard experience and deep contentment. "This is exactly where I was always meant to be, with exactly the people I was meant to love and protect." The woman who had once feared every shadow and suspicious sound now slept peacefully under open skies, protected not by walls and locks, but by the strength of community bonds that transcended artificial barriers. She had learned through fire and blood that true security came not from submission to bullies and tyrants, but from the courage to stand beside others who shared fundamental values and the determination to live free from oppression. As shooting stars traced brilliant silver paths across the infinite night sky, Clara smiled peacefully and closed her eyes completely at peace with the choices that had brought her to this moment of perfect contentment and hard-won happiness. Tomorrow would certainly bring new challenges and unexpected joys, but tonight was more than enough. More than sufficient for a woman who had discovered that the greatest adventures begin when you find the courage to refuse the limitations others try to impose on your dreams and aspirations, and when you choose love over fear, community over isolation, and justice over comfortable compromise with evil.